Hey, everybody. I hope you're doing well today. I had to say that once throughout this entire course. Welcome to low and stable rate of inflation, another macroeconomic goal of every government on this planet. Two words, very important, low, stable. Low means 2%. Stable means you keep it right there at 2%, okay? Rate of inflation. Now, a couple things, as you know already. We just covered low unemployment. Low unemployment is 5%. Low and stable rate of inflation, goal is 2%. And that means also that economic growth must be maintained at 2%. Otherwise, inflation is going to move up, okay? So let's take a look. This is just the intro video. Let's take a look at a definition, understand what it means, what inflation means, and then we can talk about how to keep it low and stable. All right. So, a definition of inflation. Inflation is defined as a persistent increase in the average price level in the economy, usually measured through the calculation of a consumer price index or CPI. Don't worry about what that is yet. We'll get into it in detail. But basically, it's just a basket of goods that most people buy, and they base the inflation calculation on that set of goods that we all sort of purchase. Okay. Important word is persistent. The word persistent is of great importance in your understanding of inflation, because a single increase in prices is not called inflation. Persistent increase in the average price level. You need to know all of those words, all that vocabulary, and all of these notes are associated with these videos, as you know, as you go through this whole course. Persistence is important because it's not a rise in prices shortly, and that's why in the short term, and that's why when I was telling you when we were drawing the neoclassical rule of 10 and the Keynesian rule of 9, that when you shift aggregate demand outward, for example, and price levels go up, you need to talk about that not in terms of inflation, but rather in terms of inflationary pressure. Because inflationary pressure is what it actually is. It means that there's a possibility that price levels might go up. Okay? But until it's sustained, it's not actually inflation. Okay. When inflation occurs, there is a sustained increase in the price level. It is also important not to confuse inflation with an increase in the price of a particular good or service. So if prices of, one particular important commodity in your country go up, that doesn't mean there's inflation. There are some exceptions to that, and the best exception, and the one you can use throughout your studies, is gasoline. If the price of gasoline goes up, which is based on the price of oil, then that's going to have inflationary pressure on all goods and services in an economy, because if you think about a grocery store, everything that's in the grocery store, including the people, at some point during the day, probably, or at some point in their lifetime, got on a motorized vehicle, a car, a van, a truck, a train, a plane, and as a result of that, they consumed gasoline. So if you think about an economy running around in trucks and cars, then imagine if the price of gasoline goes up, then the prices of everything are going to go up, because that's a major cost of production for all producers in an economy. Okay? Excellent. Now, what I decided to do right off the bat was to include the two types of inflation that we're going to talk about most. They are demand pull inflation. Can you figure out what that is? And cost push inflation. Can you figure out what that is? Demand pull inflation. It is inflation that is caused by the pulling up of price levels by demand. Oh, so how would you look at that? Well, that's why I have these graphs here. If you could imagine that there would be a long-run aggregate, I should draw it on here, a long-run aggregate supply curve right there, okay? And I'll draw it over here too. Oops. And if you could imagine that, oh, that's not where it goes. It goes over here. If you could imagine that, a long-run aggregate supply curve right there, then you have the neoclassical model right at your fingertips, right here. What happened? Well, in the beginning, there was a market equilibrium happening right there at the long-run average, the long-run aggregate supply curve, when the connection with aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. But then what happened? There's an increase in demand in the economy, increase in demand, aggregate demand, and therefore you have demand pulling up what? Price levels. So you have aggregate demand moving outward, and as a result, an increase in the average price level, and that is how you show demand pull inflation. Rockin'! And this is why I told you from the beginning Know these base diagrams, the neoclassical model, the Keynesian model. Know them, because then when you get a question like show demand pull inflation, you're like, demand pull. Oh, I could just move demand outward and I would pull up the price levels. Done. Don't memorize that diagram. Think. You can't memorize all these diagrams. You have to think, okay? And you're just starting your studies of inflation, and boom, you can already do it because you know the base diagram, okay? That's really important, really important. Okay, what about cost push? Well, you've been an economics student long enough. You know that when you hear the word cost, it has to do with supply and producers. So maybe because of a sustained rise in gasoline prices, there has been a rise in the cost of the factors of production as a result of high gasoline prices. And therefore, there's an inward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. And as a result, what did that curve do? It pushed up price levels to there. And so we have cost push or demand pull. Either way, we have higher levels of a higher average price level in the economy, and you might as well just quit. No, there's a lot more to be learned in low and stable rate of inflation. But in terms of diagramming them, in terms of understanding them, like, you got it already, and that's because you practiced that rule of 10 long ago in your studies. And here we go, my friends, we're rolling through inflation.